Thanks again, everyone, for joining us at the 2023 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference Competitive Advantage Talks presented by Kager. My name is Anna Yee, and I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. It's my pleasure to introduce the presentation, Femtech or Brotech. Our data from Wearables, missing the mark for female athletes. Please join me in welcoming Stacy Sims, author and female physiologist, to the stage.
Thanks, Anna. I know I'm up against pickleball, so I didn't expect a full room. So yes, I wanted to really kind of bring some information and highlight what's happening with wearables. I'm sure that so many people have wearables and they use it to track so many things in their life. So just as a review of wearable technology, we know that things like the Oura Ring, the Whoop, we have Garmin, their watches, we see their accessories, their medical devices, they're in smart clothing elements, and it has a broad spectrum because we're trying to integrate technology to hack the human body, so to speak. So if we think about where technology is actually used, we see it in health and fitness. That's probably the biggest place that has a mark. We see it in healthcare and medical, sports performance, hence the data and analytics here, and entertainment and gaming. We see that it's a $140 billion global market, and medical covers about 50% of that. So when we're looking at the medical space in particular, there's a new niche there. It's called Femtech, because there's this huge uproar of how come women are not being taken care of as well as men. I really credit COVID for bringing this to the forefront, because the outcomes of COVID itself were better for women who were vaccinated than for men. So when we started seeing that discrepancy, it made people sit up and take notice. So when we're talking about Femtech itself, there was more and more funding that was put into it. So $2.5 billion in funding, but it was only 3% of all digital healthcare. So the reason it was actually coined by Ida 10, she is the menstrual cycle and fertility app founder of Clue. She really wanted to bring this forward and say, hey, we need some more software diagnostics and products that are specifically focused for women, women's health, and specifically women's biological needs. And why? Because there are sex differences. So if you think about walking into a department store, you have the men's section, you have the women's section, right? You have deodorant for women, you have deodorant for men. You have bikes that are made for women, you have bikes that are made for men. But when it comes to medical and healthcare, sex differences are often ignored. So we see that sex differences exist on a cellular level. For example, women have more of the protein in the mitochondria that allow us to use more free fatty acids. So when we talk about metabolic efficiency, we talk about mitochondrial function, it's based on male data. So women don't have to do the same thing, but that's not translated. When we think about it in a medical sense, first and foremost, if we've heard about Ambien, right, and how it stays in women's systems longer, it's because most of the testing was done on men. And when we see what's happening in women, it stays in women's systems longer, and it changes across the menstrual cycle because drug metabolism changes according to sex hormones. So when we're talking about Femtech and Femtech startups, we see that there's a lot in the maternal support and health, because for a woman who is pregnant, they get ushered in and out in 10 minutes for their OB, and then when they're actually giving birth, they might have one night in hospital. So they need a lot of external care. So we're looking at medical devices, we're looking at support, we're looking at technology to help women understand what's going on and to be able to reach out when they need to. When we look down to products and services, we see that most of it, consumer products, are in menstrual cycle health and menstrual cycle tracking. So we're having a lot of information about PCOS, endometriosis, menstrual cycle, fertility. So all of that is coming up more and more. So the reason why we're having so much emphasis on Femtech, especially in trackers and wearables, is because we're looking for things that are designed in a female environment with all the women in mind. So it's a female-focused, women in mind, to close the gender data gap. And the overall idea is to improve healthcare and outcomes for women. So why am I talking about healthcare, right? Because when we talk about health, often things in health is brought over to sport. We see this so much. You see diet trends that are brought over to health and wellness. So when we're talking about wearables in sport, it's a huge market, right? We're seeing almost $80 billion, and it's predicted to be over $200 billion by 2029. And we see that technology is now integrated heavily into human performance. I'm a sports physiologist. I use wearables, and I use them to track data and help my athletes understand what's going on. I'm also a research scientist, same thing. If we're doing remote research, as COVID made us do, we were using technology to do data collection. And of course, we see sports analytics, which this whole conference is about, right? So we're looking at technology through wearables in sport. We also see that it's greatly expanded the way that athletes can perform, the way they gather data, the way they interpret it. We see that, of course, it's on the body with GPS positioning. We see that there's lots of research into concussion recovery, so they're looking at head impact, especially NFL and rugby. I live in New Zealand, so rugby's pretty big. We also see things on the inside. We're looking at heart rate variability, oxygen saturation, glucose metabolism. We're looking at core and skin body temperature. We're measuring sleep, quality and quantity. And of course, they're trying to do saliva hormone levels, which isn't quite there yet. So we're looking at all this, but one of the things I want to point out is, what is the schematic of the picture up here? It's the default dude, right? And we know that really 40% of professional athletes overall are women. So we also have to look at what are the images that are projected to us. If we're having just the male image and we're having men in the locker room, we're having male sports analyses, we're having male sports commentators, it pushes the women out, so we forget, right? So bringing awareness to the fact that 40% of overall professional athletes are women, we really need to kind of stop, pause, and think. So if we look specifically at wearables and the way they are used by coaches, we see that heart rate, respiratory rate are tracked, total sleep. We're looking for injury and illness prevention. We're looking at sessional load. We're looking at training load and training stress score. And of course, heart rate variability. The problem, though, is there are systemic biases in the algorithms, and it's specific to artificial intelligence, even the prompt engineers. So when you have companies and teams that discuss developing a wearable, an app, or an AI product, it starts with who's in the room. Now, who's in the room today is a very disproportional of what's normally in the room. There's a high proportion of women here. Probably almost every woman from the conference might be here. So when we really look around the room, the default is a cis-male. So often we talk about wearables as being bro-tech, the algorithms being bro-tech. Again, it is a way that we shrink and pink to divide and take this information and bring it to women. So it's just saying, hey, women are small men, when we know women are not small men, right? So if we're looking at these systemic biases, are we missing the mark? And I bring that to your attention because, yes, I think we are. Because as with medicine, sex differences are not considered in these algorithms. They're not considered when we're looking at developing an app or developing a technology. We know that sex differences for performance are really important because we have dose responses to training. Women are less fatigable, so the recovery time should be different. We also know that they can handle a higher training load, and often the dose needs to be higher in order to get the same adaptations that we would expect from a similarly fitness-matched man. We see changes in genetic expression, phenotypes, again, fatigability, central versus peripheral. We see differences in muscle perfusion, differences in metabolism. We see differences in immunity and stress resilience. Not only that, we have the menstrual cycle, right? Hormone fluctuations. Case in point, the immune system changes from the low hormone to the high hormone phase. In the low hormone phase, women are really stress resilient. Their immune systems are really robust on taking on virus and pathogens. But after ovulation, we have more of a pro-inflammatory response. So if we're looking at training hard, we have to counter that pro-inflammatory response and take that on board of how we are recovering. We also know that most professional athletes are using some kind of birth control, primarily the oral contraceptive pill. So this is a schematic of what happens with an oral contraceptive pill. It is a completely different hormone profile. Not only that, we see the cellular effects of synthetic estrogen is 500 times greater on the cellular level than endogenous or your naturally produced estrogen. And an oral contraceptive pill downregulates a woman's normal ovarian function. So the responses are going to be different. So these are some of the changes across the menstrual cycle. So this also includes oral contraceptive-driven cycle, even though it's not a real cycle, just putting it there. We see changes in the autonomic nervous system, so vagal tone. We see changes in the immune responses, which I just discussed. We see changes in sleep architecture, changes in thermoregulation, changes in appetite, where there's a dip before ovulation, and then it comes up in the high hormone phase because the body is building tissue. It's using building blocks and building tissue. So of course, appetite is elevated because metabolism is elevated. We see changes in mood, and that mood is motivation, cognition. We see changes in blood glucose and blood glucose regulation, as well as metabolic thresholds, so changes between carbohydrate utilization and fatty acid utilization. So these are all the changes that occur on a monthly cycle. I really specifically want to get into the autonomic nervous system and sleep, because these are two of the most tracked things using wearables that coaches rely on. So HRV, heart rate variability. So this is a measure of the autonomic nervous system. So autonomic nervous system is your sympathetic and your parasympathetic responses. Parasympathetic is your rest and digest. Sympathetic is that flight or fight. So when your heart rate variability is increased, that means you're more stress resilient. You can take on more load. So when we look at heart rate variability across the menstrual cycle with oral contraceptive and a progestin-only pill, we see differences where in the early follicular phase, everyone appears to be really well stress resilient. But as we get into the late follicular phase, which is about the 5 days before ovulation, only women in the natural cycle still have that stress resilience, as represented by their heart rate variability. We look at the progestin only, it's kind of there, it's negligible. But we look at the combined birth control, and it represents someone who is not stress resilient according to the wearable. And then as we continue and we get closer and closer to the next bleed pattern in the late luteal phase, we see that non-hormonal birth control, as well as the progestin-only pill, shows that women are not very stress resilient. This also goes with metabolic aspects of blood sugar control, as well as your immune system. But in the withdrawal phase, or the placebo pill, women have cleared out that exogenous hormone, so boom, they rebound, and they are more stress resilient. So the algorithms might read this change, but the outcomes represent poor recovery, because if your heart rate variability decreases, the algorithms read it as not being recovered. So if we're looking at an athletic standpoint, and an athlete goes, I'm not recovered, I'm not going to do well, it has that basis in the mind that I'm not going to perform well, I'm not going to train well. But if we look at it as if these algorithms are saying, hey, you're in the mid-follicular or you're in the late luteal phase, your heart rate variability is going to be decreased, we actually don't know as sports scientists if that means that the women can't train as hard or if that means they do need to deload a bit. We still have to understand that. What about training load? So this is a representative graph of our recovery metrics in strain and recovery. So we look at the progestin-only birth control. In the early follicular phase, which is the first week-ish of taking your birth control, women can take on a lot of strain and recover well. As the cycle continues, we see that, again, less and less recovery per unit of strain. When we look at non-hormonal birth control, follicular phase is beautiful. Mid-follicular phase is beautiful. Really good for stress resilience and recovery. But when we look at the oral contraceptive pill, it's bookended. So the first 5 days of the oral contraceptive pill, women can recover from high strain really well. And the last 5 days of the placebo pill, same thing. But for each subsequent day they are on an oral contraceptive pill, their ability to recover from high strain is diminished. But again, training, fatigue, and adaptation are measured using heart rate and time, our impulse response model. And as progesterone increases in the high hormone phase, as progesterone increases in the oral contraceptive pill, resting heart rate, relative workload heart rate increase because it's a change in the autonomic nervous system. It decreases vagal tone, so it does not allow women to get into that parasympathetic drive. So we see this representative in the wearables, but we actually don't know specifically if it's an indication of actual training stress or if it's a response of how these sex hormones are affecting our nervous system. Then we get into sleep. How many people had a really good sleep last night? Nice. I'll say yes, even though I'm completely jet lagged because I flew in from New Zealand. But I still came up green. Came up green even though I feel awful. So then I know that the wearable isn't really accurately describing how I feel. But when we look at the different architecture between the phases, we see that in this transition of female hormones from ovulation into the high hormone phase, we see more and more disruption in the sleep. We have more awake times. We see changes in melatonin. We see changes in dopamine. We see changes in serotonin. Why? Because these neurotransmitters are directly affected by estrogen and how much estrogen is actually in the system. We see that progesterone drives core temperature up. So when core temperature is elevated, it takes time for our temperature to actually drop off, to get into that really deep, restful sleep, and then the normal response is for our core temperature to come up and wake us up. But the baseline with that elevated progesterone is very changeable. So it takes time, and we see that women wake up a lot more when that progesterone is elevated because they're not getting down as far in that basal body temperature as they need to when they're in the follicular phase. So in this different architect between phases, we see that we have an increase in wake onset, decrease in REM sleep, we have an increase in our light sleep or non-REM, and a decrease in our efficiency. So as a wearable reading it, a lot of times the language comes out and says, you didn't spend enough time in slow wave sleep, it might impair your performance. You didn't get enough REM sleep, it's going to impair your physicality. So as an athlete or coach reading this, it's going to affect the psychological. So we really have to pay attention to what is going on. What are these algorithms reading? How are they feeding back to us? Because we have that systemic bias, but we also have the psychological component. There are many athletes who don't want to know because it plays with the mind. There's this really great study that came out that was showing that when someone came in for a VO2 max test, they went as hard as they could. And when they got blood taken and were told, oh, your genetic profile shows that you are crap as an athlete, then their VO2 max dropped, even though there was no real external force that would make that VO2 max drop. It's a psychological component. And the flip side is if they are told that they were ace from a genetic standpoint to be an athlete, their VO2 max went up. So the psychological component is very important. And we see that a lot of the outcomes that come from these algorithms have this misstep for women. Not only are they misreading the physiology, but the representation and the interpretation is also not on. So we see that these sleep disturbances are very common in the luteal phase and very common in the middle part of an oral contraceptive pill-driven cycle. So these apps often report poor sleep outcomes. And the language is amazing when I read it. I'm like, you cannot say that you have a negative effect from your sleep on someone's performance. Not even an athlete, someone who has to go into a board meeting and they're told that their sleep was not adequate. They're going to have that playing in their mind when they're trying to make critical decisions. So the question really I have for everyone, if you're a prompt engineer, if you're someone who's designing, or you're someone who's interested, or you're someone who uses a wearable. So what happens if we were to divide it up? And we're to compare the outcomes from luteal to luteal. So we're seeing the changes from phase to phase that is the same, or follicular to follicular. We can actually see the changes in training adaptations. We see the changes in our resting heart rate, our HRV, right? If we're looking at sleep architecture and trying to improve our sleep architecture, if we are comparing luteal to luteal, we can see how that sleep architecture changes when these hormones are up versus what is normal here and they compare day to day. So if you're looking at follicular to luteal, of course there are going to be differences. When and this full disclosure, I do work for Whoop, and one of the things that I keep pressing them to do is when I am in the high hormone phase, I can never get in the green recovery because my heart rate variability has changed due to progesterone. As a female physiologist and as an athlete, this is not appropriate. So I keep telling them, you have to do something. You have to go luteal to luteal or follicular to follicular, have trends. But that's not just it. What about oral contraceptive pill, IUD, implants? We have to look at group data versus individual data, right? So if you're someone who's using an oral contraceptive pill, you don't want to be compared to someone who's naturally cycling because we know the patterns are different. So you need to have an algorithm that's going to represent oral contraceptive pill versus someone who's follicular and luteal. We also want to be able to track our own trends over time, right? So we want to be able to see, again, what is my trend instead of day to day? And the algorithms don't allow us to do that. So if we were to actually look at changing this from a female perspective and putting it into a female lens and a female environment, what kind of adaptations will we be able to get out of this? What kind of insights? What kind of tracking? Because I really do not think that we have reached the true performance potential for women. Because up to this point, and still unfortunately moving forward in the near future, we're basing so much on male protocol. From basic testing of VO2, lactate, running speed, broncho tests, all this is based on male data and generalized to women. So if we're looking at technology, we need to break out of that cis-male algorithm. We need to break out of the cis-male idea and environment and really think about how is this going to encompass the female athlete? How are we going to make this appropriate for female athletes? So the question, if we don't let this cis-male idea scope our practices, don't let it scope our outcomes and the way that we interpret data to our athletes or our athletes interpret the data to themselves, what could we have, right? Initially, I look at less injury and better performance. So I have my athletes track according to the menstrual cycle. I deload them on the days where they are flat, where all of their information tells me that this is not a good day to push them. So we have reduced injury, we have more time training. More time training appropriately at high intensities when the body can take on that stress means better fitness adaptations. Better fitness adaptations means better performance down the line, right? The one caveat here is we know that training is different from performance. So that psychological aspect that I told you about, if we use that on the day of performance, there is no menstrual cycle effect because of all the skills in the taper that we put into that one day in performance supersedes these menstrual cycle effects. But training according to the menstrual cycle, again, allows us to have high training loads when the body is really resilient and to back it down to prevent injury. So I want you to take my tagline, women are not small men. Hold on to that if you take nothing else from this talk. And imagine the possibilities and allow women to work with their physiology from the planning table to the field. Because if you do that, imagine the possibilities and the potential that we have to improve women's performance. So work with your physiology and not against it. Thank you. Questions? No questions. There's one in the corner.
Thank you. Amazing presentation.
Thanks.
I had a question around sort of the ideas here were centered around individual athletes. I used to coach team sports, so how should coaches be thinking about how to manage a team when really relies on athletes working together, but you need to address individual needs?
Yeah, I get that question all the time, and I work with team athletes as well. So the idea is the awareness, right? So if we're menstrual cycle tracking and we understand that there are a few people who are on the flattest day of their cycle, then we're not going to put them into a competition to see who's going to be a starter. We're not going to push them as hard in the gym. So it's just that awareness and saying, okay, I'm not going to take this performance on the day and make my decision. The other thing is when we're in the gym, we can phase-based train in the gym. There's lots of really fantastic data that's coming out showing that if you're doing heavy power training in the follicular phase, in the low hormone phase, you get better hypertrophy and strength from a central nervous system response than you do if you're just doing normal training. So if you're phase-based training your athletes, everyone who's follicular phase is going to do one certain circuit, everyone who's in the luteal phase is going to do another, and those few who are super flat a few days out from their period might do mobilization. Because if you have an entire team in the gym, they're not all doing squats at the same time, right? So you can really phase-based train in the gym. But the biggest thing is just being aware. Because an athlete can take ownership of it and be able to say, yeah, I'm not going to judge myself today either because I know I'm always flat. And my coach is aware of that too, so it takes that psychological burden and gives some empowerment back to both the coach and the athlete.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but I believe Stacey will be outside after her talk. Please
That
give
went
another round
fast,
of applause.
thanks.
Yeah, thank you.